Now, imagine walking into a bar and in the corner, you see a man who's been carrying the weight of a lifetime of guilt. What happens when Clint Eastwood, of all people, decides to sit down and listen? The truth that comes out next will surprise you, and it might just change the way you see yourself. Stay with us because this is a journey you don't want to miss. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more inspiring content like this. The bar was dimly lit, the soft hum of a jazz tune lingering in the air. The low murmur of voices was almost imperceptible, blending into the background like a whisper from another time. Clint Eastwood entered with his usual quiet authority, the kind of presence that didn't need words to command respect. His face, though weathered with age, was as hard and unreadable as a granite statue. He walked through the door, letting his eyes scan the room as if he were looking for something, or someone. His movements were deliberate, each step measured, reflecting years of experience, a man who had seen it all and yet remained unmoved by the world around him. The bar was nearly empty, the few scattered patrons too caught up in their own worlds to notice Clint's arrival. He passed the half-lit booths and tables, until his gaze fell upon a man sitting alone in the corner. An old war veteran, his face etched with the marks of time and battle. The man was hunched over, staring at his drink, the glass in his hand trembling ever so slightly. His eyes, though distant, held stories that anyone could see if they dared look long enough. Stories of bloodshed, sacrifice, and regret. Stories that most people would rather ignore. Clint's gaze was fixed. There was something about the veteran that drew him in, like a magnet pulling him closer despite his instinct to keep moving. Maybe it was the way the man seemed lost in thought, or maybe it was the raw, unspoken history between them. Whatever it was, Clint couldn't look away. The veteran didn't notice Clint at first, too deep in his own thoughts, but when Clint's shadow fell across the table, the man slowly looked up. His eyes met Clint's for just a brief moment, surprised but not entirely shocked. There was a flicker of recognition in those eyes, something Clint had seen before in the faces of those who had been through the same hell. It was a look that only someone who had survived the unthinkable could give. Without a word, Clint reached for the empty chair across from him. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't need to. He simply pulled it out and sat down, his posture straight, unyielding. The silence between them thickened, heavy with the weight of years and unsaid things. The veteran didn't speak, but he didn't turn away either. He kept his eyes on Clint, studying him as if trying to figure out who this man was, why he was here, and whether or not he could trust him. Clint waited. He always waited. He wasn't in a rush. He knew the man sitting across from him had a story to tell, but he also knew it wasn't going to be easy to get him to open up. That was part of the game, waiting for the right moment, sensing when the other person would finally break, when the mask would slip and the truth would surface. The veteran's hand shook ever so slightly as he lifted his glass to his lips. He took a sip, his eyes never leaving Clint, but the tension in the air was undeniable. There was something about Clint's presence that unsettled him, something he couldn't quite place, yet he knew he couldn't ignore it. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the quiet clink of glass against the veteran's lips, followed by the faint rustle of Clint's jacket as he settled in for what would surely be a long conversation. Clint's voice broke the silence, low and steady, a gravelly calm that commanded attention. "I've heard about your bravery. But I think there's more to your story, isn't there?" The veteran's expression hardened, like the rock face of an ancient mountain. He didn't flinch, just took a slow, deliberate sip from his glass. His eyes remained locked on Clint, but they weren't truly seeing him. It was as if Clint was just another shadow in the corner of the room, irrelevant to the weight of memories pulling the veteran into a past he'd rather leave behind. "I don't talk about it," he muttered, his voice gravelly, almost inaudible. Clint didn't press. He was patient. He'd been in enough conversations like this before, ones that began with denial, with silence. Sometimes it was just a matter of waiting for the walls to crack. He sat there, unwavering as the seconds ticked by, the weight of the silence thickening with every heartbeat. The veteran continued to avoid Clint's gaze, his face set in a grimace. But then something shifted. His eyes darted to the side, staring out the window at the streetlights glowing like ghosts in the dark. His fingers gripped the edge of his glass so tightly that his knuckles whitened, the veins beneath his skin pulsing with tension. "You don't know what it's like," the veteran said, his voice cracking as he finally broke the silence. His words hung in the air like smoke, heavy and bitter. Clint leaned in, his gaze steady, not rushing, not recoiling from the pain in the man's voice. The veteran had turned away, his eyes fixed on the glass, but Clint didn't flinch. "I do," he replied, his voice a steady anchor. We've both been there. The veteran's face twitched, a tremor running through his body, but he remained silent. The words hit harder than Clint had expected. The veteran's breath caught in his throat, his lips parting for a moment, but nothing came out. He was trapped. Trapped by the weight of his memories, the burden of a past that refused to let him go. Clint could see the internal struggle in the veteran's eyes, the way his fingers trembled around the glass. He wasn't ready to speak yet, not fully, but Clint had done enough. He pushed just enough to see the man's defenses start to slip. The air in the bar had grown thick with the kind of tension that only a handful of people could understand. Patrons at nearby tables had gone quiet, sensing that something significant was happening, something personal, something they weren't meant to witness. They lowered their voices, casting furtive glances toward the two men sitting at the corner table. The room seemed to shrink around Clint and the veteran, as if the rest of the world had paused, leaving them alone in this moment. The veteran's breath grew shallow, and Clint watched him carefully. There was something familiar about this, about the way the man was struggling to keep his emotions locked away. Clint had seen it before, in men who'd returned from war with ghosts of their own. He knew how hard it was to face the truth, especially when that truth could destroy you. Clint shifted slightly, his voice barely above a whisper now. "You don't have to say it," he said. "I'm not here to make you relive it. But you don't have to carry it alone." For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the veteran's uneven breathing, and the quiet hum of the jazz music playing in the background. The veteran's face was still turned away, his shoulders tense, his body language screaming that he wasn't ready to let go. Clint didn't push. He never did. He understood better than most that some things took time. And tonight, whatever had brought him here, whatever force had driven him to this corner of the bar, he wasn't going to leave until that moment came. The veteran's grip on his glass loosened slightly, the tension in his hands giving way to a moment of vulnerability. It wasn't much, but it was enough to let Clint know that the wall wasn't as thick as it had been. And that, just maybe, there was a way through. Clint leaned in closer, his voice growing quieter but more intense. "We all have one moment. A moment in our lives when we have to face ourselves. It comes for all of us. You've been running from it." The veteran's body stiffened, his gaze turning to the floor as if he could block out Clint's words. But it was already too late. The moment Clint had mentioned, the one the veteran had been desperately avoiding, had arrived. The veteran shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his jaw tightening, the muscles in his neck straining. Clint could see the internal battle unfolding in the veteran's eyes, but he didn't rush him. He just waited, his presence a steady force, knowing that the man across from him was fighting a war that no one else could see. Suddenly the veteran's breath caught. His eyes glazed over, and for a moment he wasn't sitting in that dimly lit bar anymore. He was back on the battlefield. The sounds of gunfire and shouts echoed in his ears, so loud that they seemed to shake his entire body. He could feel the heat of the explosions, the dust choking his breath, the sweat trickling down his back. He saw the faces of the men he had served with, men he had led, men who had trusted him. And then it happened. The mission went horribly wrong. He had given the wrong orders, miscalculated, and people died. Good men. His men. The memory of it hit him like a punch to the gut. The guilt gnawed at him, relentless as it had for years. He had never been able to forgive himself. He had tried to bury it deep, to block it out, but it was always there, lingering in the background, threatening to destroy him. His fists clenched, the old pain flooding him again like an old wound that refused to heal. He looked at Clint, his face contorted with the weight of the past. He had never spoken of it, not to anyone. Not to his wife, not to his children, and certainly not to a stranger. But here, with Clint, something felt different. Maybe it was the quiet understanding in Clint's eyes. Maybe it was the way Clint had come into his world without judgment, without pushing. Clint, sensing the veteran's struggle, leaned back but didn't look away. He could see the storm brewing behind the veteran's eyes, the way he was trying to hold back something that needed to be said. And so Clint decided to share his own burden, his own story, hoping that by doing so he might help the veteran let go of his. "I've been where you are," Clint began, his voice steady but carrying the weight of his own past. "I've had my own battles, my own mistakes." He paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. "I remember a time years ago when I thought I couldn't come back from a loss. I made decisions that hurt people I cared about. I did things I regret, but that's life, isn't it? We mess up. We hurt the ones we love." The veteran's eyes flicked up, just enough to meet Clint's gaze. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, an acknowledgement that Clint, too, carried scars. Clint's expression softened. "There was one night I'll never forget," Clint continued. "I had nowhere to turn. I was alone, facing the consequences of everything I'd done. I didn't know how to fix it. Hell, I didn't even know if I could. But I had to face it. I had to face myself. He let the words hang in the air for a moment. And I did. I walked through that darkness, and when I came out the other side, I was a different man. The veteran swallowed hard, his throat tight. Clint's words had hit home. Maybe it wasn't the specifics of Clint's story that resonated with him, but the feeling behind it. The understanding that they both shared the same kind of pain, the same weight of regret, the same need for redemption. Clint wasn't offering answers. He wasn't here to fix anything. But he was here to say one thing: you don't have to carry this alone. The veteran's fingers trembled as he set his glass down on the table. The floodgates were opening, and for the first time in years he didn't feel the need to fight it. His lips parted, and in that quiet, raw voice he began to speak. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start. It wasn't supposed to happen that way. I wasn't supposed to lose them. I was supposed to lead them back home. The words were shaky, barely audible, but Clint heard every one of them. He didn't interrupt. He let the veteran speak, knowing that every word was a step toward something bigger, a step toward healing. Clint nodded slowly, his own memories resurfacing. "You did the best you could," he said, his voice low but full of conviction. "We don't always get it right, but that doesn't mean we're failures. It just means we're human." The veteran's breath steadied as Clint's words settled over him like a bomb. He wasn't healed, not by any means, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. The veteran sat in silence for a long moment, his fists clenched tight around the edges of the table, knuckles white with the weight of everything he had never said. His eyes were fixed on the surface, but his thoughts were far away, lost in a memory that had haunted him for decades. Clint remained quiet, letting the silence stretch, knowing that the veteran had to come to this moment on his own time. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the veteran's posture shifted. His shoulders, once rigid and tense, relaxed just enough for Clint to notice. It was a subtle change, but a significant one. The man was letting down his guard. Finally, with a voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, the veteran began to speak. "I was in charge," he said, his words heavy with regret. "We went into enemy territory, but the intel was wrong. My men, they didn't make it." He paused, his throat constricting as if he couldn't find the words to finish the sentence. But Clint could feel the weight of the truth in those words. "It was on me. I couldn't save them." The veteran's voice cracked and his head dropped, as if the burden of those words was too much to carry. His hands trembled, and Clint could see the raw pain in his face, the pain of a leader who had failed, the guilt of a man who couldn't protect the people who had trusted him. For a moment, Clint's heart ached for him, for the years of torment he had endured in silence. Clint didn't speak. He didn't offer words of comfort or advice. He simply listened, his gaze steady, understanding how hard it was to let go of the past. He knew the weight of regret, the relentless guilt that haunted you when you couldn't undo the mistakes you had made. After what felt like an eternity, Clint reached across the table and placed a hand gently on the veteran's arm. His touch was firm but kind, grounding the veteran in the present, in this moment of connection. "It wasn't your fault," Clint said quietly, his voice carrying a calm reassurance that cut through the tension. "But you've been carrying it all these years. It's time to let it go." The veteran didn't respond. He didn't have to. The words, the truth, had been spoken, and the weight of them was too much for him to bear alone any longer. Without a word, his body shook, his breath ragged. He broke down, tears flooding his eyes. They weren't just tears of sorrow, they were tears of release, of letting go of the burden that had held him captive for so long. For the first time in decades, he didn't care who saw him. He didn't care about the walls he had built around himself or the reputation he had fought so hard to maintain. In that moment, all that mattered was the weight lifting from his shoulders, the walls coming down, and the truth finally being spoken. The bar had gone quiet. The other patrons who had been murmuring in the background had stopped talking, watching the emotional scene unfold before them. The raw emotion in the air was palpable, tangible, like something that could be touched. Clint didn't look away. He simply stayed, offering his silent support, his presence a steadying force in the chaos of the veteran's emotions. And then, almost as if the universe itself recognized the gravity of the moment, the applause started. It was soft at first, hesitant, unsure of whether it was appropriate, but then it grew louder. The people in the bar were clapping not just for Clint, but for the veteran too, for the man he used to be and the man he had just become. The veteran looked up, his eyes wide with surprise. He had expected judgment, perhaps pity, but not this. Not applause. The clapping grew stronger, as though the room had collectively decided that the burden he had carried for so long had been lifted, that he was no longer the broken man who had failed his men. He was something more, someone worthy of respect, of redemption. Clint watched the veteran, his heart swelling with a quiet pride. He had known this moment would come. He had known that sometimes, all a person needed was someone to hear their story, to show them that they weren't alone. And in that moment, as the applause continued, the veteran understood that he had been forgiven, not just by Clint but by the people around him and, most importantly, by himself. The veteran stood slowly, still shaken, but something had changed. There was a subtle shift in him, like a man who had carried a great weight for years and was finally able to stand up straight again. His posture was straighter now, less burdened, his shoulders no longer sagging under the weight of guilt. His eyes were clearer, more focused, as if a fog had lifted from his mind. The past still lingered there, a shadow in the corner of his thoughts, but it no longer had the power to rule him. It was just a part of who he was, not the whole of him. He took a slow step back from the table, his hands steady now, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he exhaled deeply. The tightness in his chest, the constant pressure that had been there for years, began to ease, though he knew it would take time for the healing to fully take root. Clint, seeing the change in the veteran, stood as well. His movements were deliberate, calm as always. He didn't say anything. There was no need. The veteran knew exactly what had happened here tonight. Clint had given him something invaluable, not answers but understanding. He had given him the space to face what had been buried for so long. That was more than enough. Without a word, Clint turned toward the door. His departure was as quiet and deliberate as his entrance. There were no grand gestures, no speeches. He simply walked out of the bar, the door closing softly behind him. The veteran watched him go, his heart still racing, his emotions still raw but now under control. The moment Clint had left, a sudden stillness fell over the room, as if the bar itself held its breath. But it only lasted for a moment. Outside, in the cold night air, the veteran stood still for a moment longer. He took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill his lungs as if inhaling a new world. The city around him seemed different, the night air fresher, as if the weight of his past had shifted just enough to allow him to feel the world again. The world had always been there, but it had felt distant, out of reach. Now it was suddenly within his grasp. He turned back toward the door, his legs no longer as heavy as they once were. The weight that had been pressing down on him for so long, the burden of his guilt, had been lightened just enough to let him move forward. His hands, once stiff with the tension of years of suppressed pain, now hung loosely at his sides. He didn't feel the need to run from the world anymore. The shadows of his past were still there, lurking in the corners of his mind, but he knew they couldn't hurt him anymore. He had faced them. As he walked down the street, each step felt more confident than the last. There was still a long road ahead of him, but for the first time in years, the veteran felt like he wasn't walking it alone. The ghosts of his past would always be a part of him, but they would never have the power to control him again. Clint walked into the night, the cool air brushing against his face, his footsteps steady and measured as always. The weight of the encounter settled into his bones, familiar and yet different. For a man who had seen countless battles, who had faced down more than his fair share of darkness, this was something else. It was subtle, but it was there, a shift, a quiet understanding that sometimes, the smallest gestures could have the largest impact. Clint knew better than most that life wasn't about grand victories or heroic moments. It was about the quiet exchanges, the brief encounters that had the power to change everything. He'd had his share of regrets, his own battles, but tonight he had given someone else the chance to let go of theirs. He had shared a moment of real, unspoken connection with a man who had carried the weight of the world on his shoulders for far too long. It wasn't about fixing things, it was about giving the veteran the courage to face his past, and that, Clint knew, was enough. As he looked up at the stars above, Clint paused for a moment. The sky was wide and endless, the stars scattered like distant memories, each one a reminder of how small yet significant we all are in this vast universe. Tonight he had made a difference. In a world where so many things seemed beyond control, tonight had been a reminder that sometimes, change starts with just one person. And that was enough. Clint's journey, like everyone's, wasn't over. He had his own demons, his own regrets, but he was moving forward. It wasn't about perfection. It was about the effort, about the willingness to keep going, to face whatever came next. He would keep moving, knowing that somewhere, in a quiet bar on a cold night, he had done something that mattered. The veteran, meanwhile, had only just begun his journey. He had taken the first step toward healing, toward redemption, and the road ahead of him was still long. But for the first time in a long while, he walked with the courage to face whatever came next. His past would always be a part of him, but it no longer defined him. Clint's quiet act of listening had given him a chance to start again, to find peace in the pieces of his broken past. And so, as Clint disappeared into the night, the echoes of their encounter lingered in the air, a silent testament to the way small moments can ripple through lives, shaping them in ways that no one can ever fully predict. For both men, the road ahead would never be the same.